Hello, and welcome to Practical Steps to Enhance Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and Microsoft and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this timely panel discussion. So you're joining us for part two of a two-part series of conversations. On Friday, we did part one, which covered new challenges facing BCDR at a high level. We'll do a quick recap of that when we get into the panel discussion, or when we get the panel discussion started today. And then today we'll start looking at those practical steps and day-to-day considerations with BCDR. Now, before we get to today's informative conversation, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of the session. First off, I do want to call your attention to the Q&A panel. That's the place to say hello, which a lot of you have done already. It's also the place to let us know in the unlikely event that you're experiencing any technical difficulties. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide technical assistance. We won't have a dedicated Q&A over audio in this session, but if you do have any questions for Rubrik or Microsoft, enter them into the Q&A console. Our panelists may be able to respond in chat to some of your questions, and we'll make sure the team see them afterward as well. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I especially want to call your attention to a lot of great resources from both Rubrik and Microsoft today. There are best practices for Azure security. There's a link to Rubrik on the Azure Marketplace, a link to a joint Rubrik and Microsoft session from the Microsoft Ignite show, and a BCDR ebook. Also, there are the slides from today's presentation. Also in there, you'll find a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your technical questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have John Murphy, who's Global Field Chief Security Officer and CISO at Rubrik. And John was also here for the first part of the conversation last week. And additionally, it's great to be joined by Carl Rautenstrauch, who's a Principal Product Manager at Microsoft. So let's go on camera and bring on John and Carl. Well, John, welcome back.
And thanks, Scott. Pleasure to be here.
And Carl, it's great to have you here too. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, we're really looking forward to part two of this conversation. And John, maybe you could recap a little bit for us. Just to bring everybody up to speed on what the first part of the conversation was about.
Yeah, so it's a great intro. And I think it's important that we sort of level set in agnostic terms some of the things that we think of when we look at recovering your business and recovering your data set. I mean, the challenge I think that we all face is more and more what we do with the data we collect and how we actually manage it is the secret sauce for each one of us in terms of what value we bring to our customers, to the markets, et cetera. So I think if we think about it in terms of sort of generic capabilities, I would group them under three towers, really. Data resilience, and that is protecting the data itself, making sure the data is always in a state where we can trust that it has been unaltered and that it's exactly what we backed up. And then the second phase of that really is observability. So monitoring what's happening with your data, understanding on a daily basis each time you look at what you've backed up, what's the content there? Are there any signs that you perhaps have been infiltrated? Are there any things that you have to worry about in terms of someone having gotten access to your data and suddenly you have a very different profile, let's say, of what you're backing up than you previously have over the last 20, 30 days? And understanding that is critical because then you can take some actions in terms of securing that or in terms of preventing further progress. And I think the other piece of that that's really important is understanding what kind of data you have. So from an observability perspective, as Rubrik ingests data, let's say, or any tool ingests data, it's important to be able to understand from a metadata perspective what that exactly is, because that allows you to make some good risk decisions in terms of how you're managing things. And then that last phase really is data recovery. So at the point at which you need to bring back data from a trusted source, what's the best way to do that? And how do you move as much of that activity left of Boom as possible so that you are not thinking through those processes for the first time? And that is traditional business recovery, business continuity management. So I sort of think, in those three silos, best practices from my perspective, from a resilience perspective, is make sure you're using an immutable data source. So you're backing up your data and you know that it cannot be modified. Ensuring that it's air-gapped from your production network and that it's safe from open protocols like SMB or NFS, because that's typically what we see being attacked by the teams that are first into your environment. And then lastly, I think it just is probably one of the most enabling things you can do for your team is to assume that a breach is inevitable. Even if it isn't, you're essentially giving yourself the ability to think outside the box and to force yourself into some very uncomfortable questions. But you're doing that not at the time that a breach or an event happens. You're doing it well beforehand, and you can think about that more objectively. I think observability, I hit on a couple of things in the opening comment there, but I think looking for significant changes to the types of things that you're backing up or to the types of activities that you're seeing, looking for anyone who has accessed something that they've never accessed before might be a sign that you have an escalation or a credential problem. Hunting in your environment for IOCs, and this is likely not possible in a production environment simply because of the impact it might have on your production network and your throughput. But if you've got a secure set of data that's sitting in an air-gapped environment, you can do this constantly. And that is a huge upstep in terms of your preparation for an event. Scanning, feeding results back to your CMDB as you find, let's say, sensitive data in databases that you can actively see. Great time to bring this back to the application teams, the database developers, whoever that is, and make them aware, number one, and make sure that everybody understands the risk that you're carrying should that data be exfiltrated in an unencrypted form. You're suddenly now in a much worse position than you were before. And lastly, due care. I think due care is something from a management perspective that's becoming more and more important. And that is simply the legal concept that if you have a certain type of data, it is your responsibility to make sure you're taking care of it in line with the type of data that really is. And then recovery, I think recovery is straightforward for most people to understand this. It's really understanding what the crown jewels are, understanding what we have to do to protect those crown jewels. How do we quarantine in the event that something looks amiss, that down to the file level, that something seems like it's not quite what it was or what we expect it to be. And that ties back to new trends we're seeing in terms of attacks, things like partial encryption. That suddenly make it very, very easy for attackers to increase their speed of attack by only partially encrypting files. But that's something you need to be able to detect. And automating your playbooks, testing until you're tired of testing, is probably the catch-all that we've been using for decades. It's just that you've got to be prepared for when an event occurs, and how quickly you recover is directly tied to how much you prepared for in advance. And then automation, I think the last thing there, Scott, is just the more we can take the humans out of the equation when we know exactly what has to be done, the better off we're all going to be in terms of getting data back up to where it should be and recovering systems quickly.
Okay, no, that's great. Those are some really good best practices, and from an agnostic perspective. And just before we get further into the conversation, I just wonder if you can also level set a little bit about how Rubrik fits in. How you guys implement those best practices.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So if we look at the slide that's coming up next, I think the thing that you'll see is Rubrik has brought all of this together under Rubrik Security Cloud. And that is a set of capabilities that really build upon what we do today from a data protection perspective, but give you the ability to port that data to wherever you would like it to port to. So in this particular case, we have these capabilities sitting in Azure today. They're ready for consumption. And we provide all of the feature sets that I mentioned under resilience, recoverability, and observability in Rubrik Security Cloud today. So these are services that we've well established with Azure over the last 2 years, 2+ years actually. And we have many clients using those today. So as you can see, we bring all of this together under one place. It simplifies a lot of what security teams have to worry about today and IT operation teams as well. And it gives you a single pane of glass, the mythical single pane of glass that we're all looking for, to understand what the state of your data is and how you can move that data between environments, whether you want to recover on-prem or you want to recover in a cloud environment. The ability to say that I now have the ability to extend my data sets, my backups to other environments, it brings an enormous amount of capability to organizations.
Super. And John, you mentioned Azure there a couple of times. We've got Carl here from Microsoft. Carl, I have a question kind of, related to Azure a little bit. Why is it important that the DR is simplified, and that it leverages immutable data sources in Azure?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Scott. And I think John did an outstanding job of outlining the challenges and the problems that customers are facing today, our mutual customers. In an increasingly complex world that involves hybrid and multi-cloud, that involves attack vectors that didn't exist a few years ago, or in many cases, even a few months ago, simplicity is really key. So when you look at using a public cloud as a recovery environment, or you're responsible for recovering resources, assets, and services in a public cloud environment, simplicity is king. You have to have automation. You have to have test plans. You have to have executed test plans. And you have to know that you've done everything within your power to secure all aspects of that environment, all key resources, from identity to the network perimeter to the virtual machines or containers themselves, and really having tooling that can help you to separate the signal from the noise and keep up with all of this activity and keep an eye on your environment without having to staff up in a massive manner, which we all know is incredibly difficult right now, is very, very hard to hire. It's even harder to hire experienced, competent people. You need the right tools to help you. And I think that's really what we have focused on in this partnership, is providing customers with best of breed tooling that does separate that signal from the noise.
Yeah. John, anything that you wanted to add there?
No, I think Carl hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think you asked initially about simplicity, and I think that is the one thing that, cloud brings a lot of new capabilities to organizations, and some of that is basically understanding how you want to manage a cloud environment versus an on-prem environment. There are different tool sets involved, there are different skill sets involved, but I think at its core, the thing that we need to come back to from a capability perspective is simplicity, right? There should be no difference if I look at Azure as an extension of my data center. There should be no difference in how I understand what that data is, how I treat that data, how I can bring that data back into production, use it for other purposes. And so I think the simplicity aspect of it really can't be overstated. It's critical that we don't have dual skill sets. There are people who help us internally, and then there are people who help us if the data is sitting out in the cloud, or different sets of practices when we want to recover based upon where the data is coming from. It really has to be consumable, very simple to understand.
Those are really great points. Simplicity is so important. And John, you talked a lot about best practices, sort of at the top there. And I actually wonder, Carl, do you have anything that you want to add about, best practices that you're seeing? Um,
Yeah, I mean, really just an extension of what John already highlighted. I mean, assume everything is broken, assume intrusion all the time, lock everything down. We have capabilities to prevent deletion of resources. You should absolutely have that enabled so that there's nothing accidental or malicious that can happen to your environment. You should have every level of protection and backup possible. Don't assume that a service, whether it's a SaaS offering or something that you've built internally and deployed on a public cloud or on premises, is being protected. Make sure it is part of your inventory, that it is something that you are protecting, and enable just what you need when you need it. Just-in-time networking, for example, with public cloud resources should be your default behavior. And that should be something that you're using scanning engines like Azure Advisor to make sure that you have set up. And if you're flagged with a security alert, pay attention to that, take care of it. And I know as a former administrator, it can be a little difficult at times to take those extra steps to do your job, but it's just something that isn't a choice anymore in this world. You need to add those layers of security that may have existed for years but haven't been implemented. It's absolutely critical. That is a must-have best practice.
Yeah, that's really really interesting. Now, one of the things today's session is about sort of practical steps. So John, practically speaking, what types of risk are you guys helping with? Is it financial, regulatory, reputational, legal? What do you focus
So yeah, there you go. Scott, you covered all of them. Sort of the big buckets are those four. We look at it in terms of risk to an organization. Number one, it's increasingly apparent that we are becoming more and more data dependent by the day. AI, ML, they are all heavily dependent on large data sets. Those data sets are not necessarily anything that we design for. They just have to be transactional. And so the possibilities of building on new models, bringing in new algorithms that we want to explore is virtually unlimited. But it all starts with understanding what exactly we have in terms of the data itself. And those implications really spread across all four of those domains you just mentioned. So certainly from a financial perspective, protecting the organization, understanding that you have to make sure that your organization can continue to exist. In the event that you're hit with something that is like a ransomware attack or a destructive malware attack that looks to take you out of the ability to control that data and actually to provide whatever services you provide to the market. That's critical. I think regulatory, certainly, we mentioned due care on the previous slide, and that goes to regulatory as well as legal. But certainly there are high expectations and those are increasing, that we're held to. So I think if you look at from a regulatory perspective, a legal perspective, there are lots of stories in the news these days about CISOs being held accountable for certain decisions, for decisions being made from a security perspective that may not be in the best interest of shareholders, but were not exactly transparent to markets. And organizations like the SEC are very, very, very apparent now that they are concerned about this. So I think from that perspective, what we do here really does have more of a regulatory legal angle to it than it's ever had before. And of course, reputation. So organizations are constantly building on, how much trust do I have with the public? And trust is one of those things. You give it up very, very easily. You earn it very, very slowly. And in the event that you suddenly lose that with customers, it takes a long time to reestablish. So I think we see lots of times where brand has been damaged because of an event that's completely outside the control of the organization. However, it doesn't really matter, right? Because once the customer feels less likely to trust you with their data, then you suffer many, many consequences that go with it. But I think those four buckets really do talk about just what it is that we are trying to prevent and help organizations with.
Excellent. Yeah, and Carl, was there anything that you wanted to add on that?
No, just, I mean, really reinforcing the fact that it is so hard to earn a reputation as somebody who is focused on security, who does operate with, without a risk present for your customer base. And for anyone who has as much gray in their beard as I do, you're going to remember those days around the turn of the millennium, where it felt like there was a new Microsoft security flaw every day. The blaster worm, you name it. I mean, it was just an incredible deluge of bad news, and it really took a decade plus to get to the point where that reputation was out of memory. And getting back to that point can happen very, very quickly if you're not paying attention and doing your due diligence. So agree 100%. We've seen it, we've lived it.
Yeah, I'm glad you called that out, because that really resonated with me too, John. Your comment about trust is so hard to rebuild.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at trust, a different kind of trust. Carl, why is a zero trust approach to protecting access to systems and data so important now?
Yeah, it really has become the de facto in the world that we live in now. I mean, not only are there more potential ways to get into systems by necessity, the pandemic really forced a push to cloud for applications that folks hadn't originally thought of deploying in a public cloud environment, but remote locations, work from home, forced our hands collectively. And having individuals access your internal applications and your public-facing applications in ways you hadn't anticipated means you have to have those controls built in up front. So we're a perfect case in point. Yes, we do allow bring your own device. I have personal devices that I connect to Microsoft systems. Our IT team enforces security standards in terms of versions, in terms of antivirus software, in terms of threat recognition, threat detection software. And in the case of working here from my home office, mandatory VPN when I attempt to access an internal system. And then always a challenge and response. My multi-factor authentication is constantly brought to the forefront to make sure that, yes, it is me using this laptop on my desk. So we live in a world now where this is no longer a choice. Zero trust and trust and validate are the way that we need to do business going forward. And I don't see that slowing down. John, not sure about you, but I don't see that trend reversing.
No, not at all. No, I would add to it a little bit because I've been in the industry for a really long time. Started as a programmer and wrote a lot of code for many years. I can tell you that prior to, I would say, the turn of the millennium, the concern really was around usability more so than it was around security. So we would write systems for roles, for people who had specific roles that we're going to use the applications for. And we designed, by default, a whole lot of trust into that. We assumed that the user was going to do what they were supposed to do, and that anybody who had access to it was really somebody that we could inherently trust. And I think that, obviously, as legacy systems age out and we replace them, we also just need to recognize that until that's done, you do need to make sure that you are trusting but verifying upon any access to a system, a network, a data set of any kind, simply because we don't know who is going to be in our environments now. It sort of goes back to assume breach. And sort of that being the underlying principle that you build and operate your environments on. But I think it's critical just because it also enables you to say, at any point in time, I have to take these steps because they are in the best interest of the business and the existence of the business, as opposed to saying, well, you know what, that might slow down response time by a second or two, or 10 seconds for a user to click into the VPN to make sure they're protected. Those things are inevitable. But they're also, I think, a cost of doing business more and more. So as we look at zero trust and why we're seeing such a proliferation of different types of solutions to zero trust, I think the common basis is that we need to make sure that people who have access to systems are ones that should have access, and that access is constantly verified.
So, Carl, one of my favorite things to talk about whenever I'm talking about cloud, security, disaster recovery is the shared responsibility model. I always use a slide from Microsoft there, but I'd love if you could talk a little bit about concepts around shared responsibility and what, if any, impact it has on traditional BCDR in a world with increasing attack vectors.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I think there's a lot of misperceptions out there, both bad and good, about this topic. And really, the way to frame this is to remember that for any public cloud provider like Microsoft with Azure, we need to make sure that we are taking into account not only our own operational excellence, but we're accounting for the fact that our customer base has industry regulations and governmental regulations that they need to adhere to. And the fact that not only does Microsoft have adversaries that are coming after us in our properties, but our customers may as well. So we need to take that into account, and we need to share that responsibility with protecting our customers. There. And really, one of the ways that I like to highlight what we do is we have a tremendous amount of assets, both people and software and systems that help to spot potential threats that may be attempting to attack our customers, identify those, share that information with governments where appropriate when we have a bad government actor, for example, who is attacking our properties and possibly causing a threat to many, many others. So we do everything we can to analyze the signals that are coming in our own base across our assets and our customers, and use that as threat intelligence to prevent really bad things from happening. But what I do want to highlight is that this is a shared responsibility model. So there are things that we do on behalf of all of our customers inherently, and that's what you see highlighted here on this very eye chart oriented slide with the yellow boxes. But then there are platforms, tools, and services that we provide to our customers that they need to put in place to control and provide an appropriate level of access to their own applications and resources, whether it's internal facing or public facing. And I don't want to make this into a product presentation, but just to give you an idea of the portfolio of security-oriented services that we provide, this is what we do across the spectrum of storage, network, machines, processes, procedures to enable our customers to protect themselves and share in that responsibility with us. Our security center is amazing. If you ever get to tour our campus and take a look at that security center and look at the incoming threats from nation states or inbound from botnets, it's just overwhelming, the amount of security, telemetry, and signals that we collect and we respond to. But we cannot do it alone. We need our customers to use the tools that we provide to pay attention to things like the signals that Azure Advisor bubbles up, and to lock those down, to take advantage and make sure that you're adhering to those best practices. And that's where the sharing comes in. We do everything we can to protect our customers. We also need our customers to use the tools and protect themselves. And Rubrik is a fantastic partner in this space and really helps us to do everything we can to help our joint customers.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you both being here. We're just about up on time. And I want to give each of you an opportunity to just, let people know, if they're interested in what we've been talking about here and want to learn more about how to get started both with Azure, on sort of a DR business continuity standpoint, and Rubrik, what's a good place to start? So maybe Carl, I'll start with you on that question, and then I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Rubrik team has done a phenomenal job of building a landing page for all things Azure and Rubrik. So if you head to Rubrik.com and look up at the top menu, you'll see there's a solutions section for Azure. some great white papers and best practices guides, phenomenal demos, explanations of what we do together, all of the depth of integration between our two companies and our platforms. Great place to start. And then we have content as well on docs.microsoft.com that showcases how to combine our two technologies and get the best result from two best of breed platforms.
Super. And John?
Yeah, so hard to top that. So I think Carl hit all the right points there. Without a doubt, I would just point to the number of clients that we have jointly who are leveraging these services today and who are enjoying a much quieter night and a better night's sleep because they're not worried about the things that typically happen to customers who aren't using best practices in terms of protecting the data in the cloud environment or even on an on-premise environment. I think there are a ton of great thought leaders on both sides of the aisle here. I think Microsoft definitely leads the way in terms of understanding how best to leverage the platform and all of its capabilities. And I think from a data portability perspective and a data protection, data security, data management kind of umbrella, I think we've got a lot that we offer here on the website as well. And happy to talk to anybody who's got questions, wants to take that to a little bit deeper level.
Well, and speaking of thought leaders, it's been great to have both of you on for this conversation. This has been really informative. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody in the audience has as well. Thanks so much for being here.
I thank you for that. This has been absolutely great.
And as we wrap up, we have one more thing to cover. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that gift card is Julio Rivera from Texas. So congratulations to Julio. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik and Microsoft for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.